Chapter 15. In her slow dream time, Liz wished for powers like Max's. He would be able to fight that thing, whatever it was. Liz had powers of her own, but now they seemed like a cruel joke. They would merely allow her to see her best friend die twice. She could also sometimes move objects with her mind and release energy as well, but she couldn't do either on demand, and she had almost no control. There has to be another way, she thought, looking behind her. The creature was close behind them. The problem was that the balcony was just ahead of them, and then it was at least 30 feet to the floor. For a moment, she wanted to grab Maria so they could turn and fight. It was what Max would do, even if he knew the fight was lost from the beginning. Liz might have done it too, except Maria was going too fast and was too close to the balcony for Liz to stop her now. She was going to go over, and Liz was going to watch her for the second time. Liz felt a moment of helplessness and then realized that while she didn't have Max's powers, it didn't mean she was powerless. And she didn't have to stop Maria. Of course, there was only one chance, and even if she succeeded in what she wanted to do, there was no guarantee that she or Maria would survive. Well, there were never any guarantees. She had learned that 3 years ago when she was shot at the crash down. A miracle had brought her back, and since then she had been living on borrowed time. Liz Parker saw her one chance and took it. They were just a few feet from the edge. The only thing that pushed Liz to take action was that in this instant she was more afraid for Maria than she was of anything else. Reaching out with both hands, she grabbed at the back of Maria's jeans, getting a tight grip on the denim. Then Liz took one step to the left and pulled with all of her might as she threw all of her weight to the left. The result was just what Liz was hoping for. They were still moving forward, but angling to the left. A fraction of a second later, Liz saw that Maria was going to miss the railing. Instead, both girls were barreling toward the large curving staircase. Liz felt a momentary rush of satisfaction. She had prevented her vision from coming true. Maria did not go over the balcony, but she and Liz were now racing over the edge of the staircase, and they hurtled over the edge, and Liz felt her feet leave the floor. She had a single clear thought as she and Maria launched themselves into space. It's a long way down. Max woke up slowly. The closer he came to consciousness, the more he felt the pain in his head. For a moment, he considered allowing himself to slip back into darkness. At least it hadn't hurt so much when he was there. No, there's something I have to do, he thought. Then it all came flooding back. The house. Isabel gone. The creature at the top of the hill. There was danger to his friends, to Liz. Max tried to push himself up and found that his body was not cooperating. He sent the commands to his arms, but they moved sluggishly and didn't push him hard enough to sit up, let alone get up. He took an inventory of his pains and realized there were cuts and scrapes and a significant pain in his left shoulder. But the worst by far was the pain in his head. Slowly, he reached back with his hand and felt for the back of his head. When his fingers finally got there, they found his hair matted and wet. No, not wet, slick. He was bleeding pretty heavily. He knew a blow to the back of the head could be serious and that there might be a concussion. He needed to take care of that before he did anything else, but his mind was slow, mushy. Not a good sign, he thought, but his friends were depending on him. Michael, he thought. Michael had fallen with him. Max tried to lift his head to look for his friend or to call out, but his physical responses were off. Definitely not good, he thought. He would have to heal himself first, at least his head. It was hard to concentrate, but he forced himself. Max kept his hand on the split in his scalp. Summoning his powers and reaching out with his mind, he saw the split in the skin. That would be easy to repair, but there was something else. His skull was cracked as well. Focusing his energy, he willed the bone to heal. Then he brought the skin together, keeping his hand there to eliminate the swelling and any other damage in the area. After a few seconds, his head cleared and it was like waking suddenly from a deep sleep. Max was alert, which made him even more conscious of the pain coming from half a dozen places on his body. He brushed them aside and got to his feet. His right knee protested slightly, but it held. Michael, he called out, but there was no response. Looking around, he saw a tree behind him which had a dent in the bark and a dark spot. That must have been where he'd hit his head. Looking up, he saw that he was maybe 30 yards from the top of the hill. He could see the path he had taken down when the creature had what? What had the creature done to him and Michael? It had pushed them off the top, but it had never physically touched either of them. Did this thing have powers like his? Well, maybe Max wouldn't be caught by surprise twice. A few feet to his right, he saw what must have been Michael's path down the hill. There were broken saplings and flattened brush. Michael had come to a rest just above Max, maybe 10 yards closer to the top. Max found the spot at the end of the trail. There was some blood there, but no Michael. Just when Max thought Michael had gotten back up the hill on his own, he saw another path through the brush. This one was smoother and more regular. Suddenly, Max was sure that the creature had come back and dragged Michael to the house while Max lay unconscious. But why? Why leave Max? Too many questions and no time to answer them. Max started up the hill and felt his knee twitch. He ignored it as he ignored the other cuts and scrapes, except the one on his left shoulder. That one was bad and made it hard to move his arm. He knew that soon he would have to fight. He couldn't afford the handicap, so he used his good hand and covered the area. As he walked, he reached out with his powers. There was a deep puncture in his left shoulder that probably was from a broken branch. It healed quickly, which was a pleasant surprise. In the past, he had found that it was harder to heal himself than to heal others, and it usually required greater concentration. A year ago, he would not have been able to manage it that easily. His powers were growing, developing, and right now that meant only one thing to him. He would be in a better position to save his friends. It's my fault. It has them, he thought. He had insisted they come here to hide from the special unit. He had allowed Isabel to sleep in her own room, and he had agreed to separate rooms for the rest of them because he had wanted to be alone with Liz. He had failed his sister and Michael for the second time, just like he had failed them and everyone else on their home planet. And he had failed Liz and Maria and Kyle, who depended on him to make the right decisions, whether or not he wanted the job of leader. Well, he might not be fit to be king, but he was fit to fight this creature to make up for some part of his failures. He was up over the top of the hill and down the side quickly. By the time he was in the open field, the pain in his body had receded from his consciousness. All he could think about was Liz and his friends in the hands of that thing. Well, ghost or not, the creature was going to regret messing with them tonight. He ran across the field, looking up at the moon, which now much lower in the sky. He must have been out for a couple of hours at least. Plenty of time for anything to happen to his friends. Max pushed the thought aside. It wouldn't help them, and he needed to focus on what he had to do. And he had to do it coldly, without getting lost in his feelings. His knees throbbed at the stress of his sprint across the field, but he ignored it. There was no time to heal it now. When he reached the house, he was not surprised to see the middle basement doors open. The light was on inside. He headed down the basement stairs quickly and came to another open door and another staircase. Max knew his friends and that thing that had taken them were down these stairs. He also knew that this was some sort of trap. Well, the creature may have thought it had him, and it had caught him by surprise on the hill, but there were some things it didn't know about him, things that Max would show it soon. Max bounded down the stairs, careful of his injured knee, and stepped through a door that revealed a short corridor, brightly lit with strong fluorescent light. At the end of the corridor was another heavy door, which he reached in seconds. As he opened the door, he felt ready for anything as he stepped into the next room. The creature was standing at the end of a large room, waiting for him. Max lifted his hand, ready to blast the thing with everything he had when he took in the rest of the room. For a moment, he was too stunned to move. "Get out of here!" Liz screamed. "Run!" Isabel said. Max didn't move. He looked at his sister and his friends. They were each restrained somehow in open semicircular glass chambers on each wall. Isabel, Liz, and Maria were on one side, Kyle and Michael on the other. There were at least a dozen empty chambers on each side as well, all closed. There were computers and pieces of household electronics that Max recognized. And there was other equipment that Max had never seen before. The combination of the two made the place look thrown together. For an insane moment, he had the feeling that he was looking at Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory. Go ahead and blast me, the creature said, but if you do, your friends will die. Max felt his head swim. There was something going on here that was stranger than ghosts and evil spirits. He shook off his doubts. Whatever the thing in front of him was, it was real, and that meant it could be hurt or killed. Max got the feeling that that wouldn't be hard to do. The creature was literally falling apart, and its labored breathing, croaking voice told Max that the thing would die soon, whether or not Max did anything to it. Maxwell, get out of here, Michael said. Max resisted the temptation to look at his friend. From his voice, Max could tell that Michael was in pain. His peripheral vision told him that Liz and the others were alive. That'll have to be enough for now. He kept his eyes on the creature and demanded, "Who are you, and what is this place?" The creature gave a short laugh and said, "You haven't figured it out yet, Max? I'm not surprised. You never were very quick." The thing looked at him, and Max recognized something in its eyes, despite the ruined gray flesh around them. Zan. A flood of realization hit Max. It couldn't be. It made perfect sense, but it was plainly impossible. "Oh my God," Isabel cried.
Chapter 16. It can't be you, Isabel said. For a moment, she couldn't say the name. When she finally did, she spat it out. Nicholas. In the flesh, as it were, he said. Then he stepped closer to Isabel and smiled, at least the one side of his face that still had lips curled upward. After all we've been through, I'm glad to see you recognize me. Isabel couldn't believe it, but it was Nicholas. She could see the shadows of him in his ruined face and in his voice. You should be dead by now, she said. I really should be, Nicholas said. All the others are dead thanks to you all, and this husk is way past its expiration date. Isabel, you know this guy? Kyle asked. We all do, Isabel replied. He was one of the skins of Copper Summit. Not just one of them, my dear. I am Kabar's voice on this planet, Nicholas said. You should show some respect. Kabar is your king. Just kill him, Max, and let's get out of here, Michael said. To Isabel's surprise, Max raised his hand. It seemed like he was about to do just that. Don't do it, Max, Nicholas said, raising one hand in the air. He was hiding a small remote control of some kind. If I die, your friends die, Nicholas said. He's bluffing, Michael said. Do it. This controls the electrodes that are attached to your friends' heads, he said. Then he felt the control, and Isabel felt her head turn to fire. She could hear Michael call out as well. Okay, stop, Max said, but he didn't put his hand down. See the electrodes on each of their foreheads? They are directly over the cerebral cortex. A mild change disrupts your special abilities. That's a little trick I learned from your friends in the special unit. They know quite a bit about your psychology, about your physiology. Too bad you didn't stay long enough for them to do a proper dissection, Nicholas said. You're working with a special unit, Isabel said. We don't exactly work together, but they've been useful, Nicholas replied. You were the one who told them where we were, Max said. An anonymous tip, he said. Like I said, they have been useful. Actually, I wanted them to save me the trouble of capturing you, but you didn't cooperate. Isabel felt the beginnings of an idea, decided to keep talking. He was vain, a braggart, actually. Maybe he would reveal something he could use. How did you find us? Isabel asked. A happy accident. You wandered into the range of my equipment. Really lucky for me. I'm not feeling so well these days. I don't know if I would have had time to grow another husk, Nicholas said. You did something to our van, Isabel said. Suddenly things were becoming clear to her, and she felt a rising anger. You were painfully easy to manipulate. When you escaped the special unit, a little bright light to attract you to the spot, in a little car trouble, and you wandered right into my hands. You humans, even half-humans, are a depressingly simple species, Nicholas said. You've set it all up. The Bentons, the book, everything, she said. Actually, my dear, there really was a family called the Bentons, and a crazy old man who raved for these halls for years. Fortunately, he kept this remote house in good condition. Perfect for me to grow some new friends, he said. The Bentons had lived and died in this house, but how much of what she had felt had been real? She couldn't believe that he had come here, disturbed this house that had been such a good place, a comfortable place. He had brought his evil here, his rotting, stink-sulling, whatever the Bentons had left of themselves, in this house. She wasn't just angry now, she was furious. That was you calling my name, Isabel said. And you came so quickly. Investigating ghosts, Valandra? You were always flighty, but I think you let these simple, superstitious humans get to you, Nicholas mocked. That's what the plastic is for, Liz said. And the food, more of the husks. Nicholas looked at Liz with approval. Max, it looks like your taste in woman is improving. Stay away from her, Max said, his voice booming. To Isabel's surprise, Nicholas took a step back. He's afraid. He doesn't want to die, she thought. You're right. New house need a clean environment, Nicholas said. Then he turned back to Isabel. I'm growing a special one for myself, something I think you will like. Tall and strapping, perfect for your shallow sensibilities. He stared at her as if he knew something about her. In the past, he had claimed that she and he were lovers on their home world, but he had also claimed that she had betrayed a brother and her people, and she had learned that was a lie. Kill him, Max, she found herself saying. Nicholas turned quickly to face Max. I wouldn't, Max. This device is what you might call a dead man's switch. If I let go of it, your friends will get the shock of their lives, he said, flashing his rotting grin. Now, with your abilities, you might be able to heal them, save one, maybe two, before it's too late. But which ones? Isabel saw the pain on Max's face. There had to be something she could do to help. She tried to summon her powers, but found Nicholas had been telling the truth about them being blocked, and with her hands strapped behind her and attached somehow to the chamber, she could hardly move. Still, there had to be something. Then there was the beginnings of an idea. Isabel remembered seeing similar chambers in Copper Summit. The ones holding her and her friends looked different, more crude, but similar. She remembered the day in Copper Summit when she had seen them, when she had first met Nicholas. What's your plan? I don't think you're going to last until the new husks are grown. Doesn't that take 20 years? Isabel asked. True, he nodded. But I've improved the process. Necessity is a mother, you know. And I don't mind saying that it was tricky with this planet's limited technology. You destroyed all of our best equipment back in Copper Summit. It was like using stone knives and bearskins to create a growth chamber. Still, I did it. Nicholas leaned into her. Impressed, dear? Isabel spat in his ruined face. You had 50 years to get us the first time. Do you really think another 50 will make a difference? She said. Well, it looks like I won't even need that long, Nicholas said. It looks like my mission is almost complete. Your mission? She asked. Bring the Granolith back to Kavar, and with it the head of Zan. Nicholas said. Well, it looks like you're going to have to go home empty-handed, Michael said, because you'll get nothing from us. Really? Nicholas said. Then he turned to Max. You wouldn't sacrifice yourself for your friends? Give me a little artifact to save your sister, your friends, and your new mate? Gotten a little cold-hearted over the years, have we, Zan? Don't listen to him, Max. You can't trust him, Michael said. Isabel could see the pain on Max's face. He would sacrifice himself for her, or for any of them, but she couldn't allow it. You think that if you do that, you'll return to Kavar a hero? Isabel challenged. Mission accomplished, and for that, I get one of the 5 worlds to control, he said. Isabel nodded. I'm sure Kavar values your services, but why didn't he recall you home before you fell apart? This isn't the movies, Isabel. Space travel is not that simple, he said. Really? Kavar didn't mention that when he was here, she said. What? Nicholas said. Kavar was never here. Of course he was. He came to get me. Said there was some new technology for the return trip. He said I could go home, Isabel said. Nicholas looked stricken, then furious. You're lying, he screamed. This is a trick. He wanted me to come with him, Isabel said. Odd that he would offer me a trip home just to get me in the sack, but not to you, his valued aid, when your life depended on it. Doubt flashed across Nicholas's face. It's true, you know it is, Isabel said. Yeah, that's the problem with backstabbing weasels like Kavar. You just can't trust them, Michael said. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, and then he raised his head and leveled his gaze at Isabel. Kavar's a born leader. He does what he has to do, he said. You just keep telling yourself that, Isabel replied. For all you know, he is no more use for you. If he even allows you to come home, you don't know what you'll find or what kind of welcome you'll get. Nicholas only shrugged. I know what happens if I stay here. I'm stuck on this backwater of seas for a planet forever. No thanks. I'll take my chances with our glorious leader. He spun around and said to Max, it will be worth it to see his expression when I throw your head at his feet. Isabel saw a twisted smile on his face and a wild look in his eyes. More than his body is falling apart, she thought. He's losing it. But he still had a cunning intelligence that Isabel didn't like. He turned to Max. It's time to stop playing games. Let them go, or I will kill you. Right here, right now, Max said. There was steel in his voice. Nicholas laughed, a grating sound from a decaying throat. And watch your friends die? I know you too well. You never could make sacrifices. That's why you're here and Kavar is sitting on your throne. History repeats itself, Max. Destiny brought you here. Do you believe in destiny, Max? I do. I've always been a student of history, even Earth history, stupid and short as it is. And there is one thing that I've learned. There are always patterns and cycles. History does repeat itself, Max. You're here so I can defeat you again, so I can kill you again, just like I did last time. That should suit you, Max. You die, but you save your friends. It's so predictable. It's so you. A martyr's death, but this time no one but us will know or care. Of course, if you choose to fight, you will probably beat me. My powers aren't what they used to be, Nicholas taunted. Don't do it, Max, Liz called out. End this now. If you give him what he wants, he'll kill us all anyway. Max looked from Liz to Nicholas, then to the rest of his friends. You'll let them go if I go with you? Max said. No, Max, Michael said. And show me where the granite is? Nicholas said. Do that, and they will all be free to live out their lives on this puny rock. Max, don't, Liz pleaded, tears running down her face. Max looked at her for a moment, and then he lowered his hand. Okay, how do you want to do this? He said. First, I need you to do something for me. You see, I've been feeling a little under the weather lately. You need to fix that, or this house won't last long enough to do what we have to do, Nicholas said. I don't know if I can, Max said. You'll have to if you want to save your friends. That's the deal, Nicholas stated. What guarantee do I have that you'll keep your end of the bargain? Max asked. Well, I can guarantee that if you don't do as I say, your friends will die, he said. Then he lowered his voice. Once I have you in the granolith, I don't need them. Var doesn't need them. I'm prepared to leave the non-combatants out of this. But it's up to you. Max was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded and said, I'll do it. Chapter 17. Max felt defeated. I failed them again, he thought, looking at Isabel and Michael. He had led them to destruction before, now he had done it again, and this time he'd led Liz there too, along with Kyle and Maria. They had all depended on him, whether he had wanted the job or not. Now they were in the hands of an alien who had one purpose for the last 50 years, to find him. Well, Nicholas could have him. His life was worth Liz's or Isabel's or any of his friends. At least then his life would mean something more than it had up till now. It seemed like he had done nothing in his 18 years but protected his secret, protect himself. Was that why he had come here? Was that why he had been recreated and sent halfway across the galaxy to protect himself while others made the sacrifices that counted? Liz had sacrificed too much for him. Alex had sacrificed his life. Isabel had given up any chance at a normal life of her own. Well, that would all change now. He didn't trust Nicholas, but his friends were dead until he gave Nicholas what he wanted. At least then they would have a chance. If something went wrong, maybe Michael and Isabel would find a way to save them. Then hurry, Max. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not getting any younger, Nicholas said. His friends were calling to him, begging him not to. He ignored them. It would just make it harder for him to do what he had to do. Besides, he wasn't through yet. Maybe he could give Nicholas a surprise. But he couldn't do anything while Nicholas held his friends' lives in his hands. Now, Nicholas said, approaching him. Lie down, Max ordered. Even if this worked, it would be rough for Nicholas. His body was literally falling apart. If he was lying down, he was less likely to drop the remote control. Nicholas laid down and looked up at Max. Looking down, Max could see that Nicholas was very close to death, maybe closer than Clayton Wheeler had been. Max had been able to restore Wheeler to youth, but doing it had cost Max his own life. He heard Liz's voice, but tried to shut it out. She knew what he was about to do and what the effort might cost him. He did not respond. He knew he couldn't if he wanted to keep his resolve and do what he had to do. It might mean he would not have a chance to say goodbye to her or to any of them, that he had no choice. Raising his hands, Max took one last look at Nicholas. A full third of his face was gone, and another major part of it was dead already. Nicholas's eyes stared up at him. They were full of malice. Max didn't want that to be the last thing he saw. He glanced up at his sister, then his friends, and finally Liz. She was calling to him, but he ignored that sound. Instead, he studied her face, taking in every detail. Then Max closed his eyes and put his hands on Nicholas's body, one on his head and one on his chest. As his hands touched Nicholas, he felt an instant revulsion. Beneath the clothes, Nicholas's flesh did not feel springy as a normal person's would. It felt tough, more like meat than living tissue. Max knew he could kill him now, channeling his energy to tear apart Nicholas's body, but he knew he would not, because if he did, he would cost his friends any chance they had. Taking a deep breath, Max concentrated and reached out with his powers, looking for what was wrong with Nicholas's husk. He was surprised to see that the husk was mostly human, organs and flesh with an alien brain. There was a small metal device at the base of the spine. That was where the husks were vulnerable, he knew. A blow there and they would literally turn to dust. Max concentrated on the human portion of the husk, the decaying and dying part of Nicholas. He imagined the damaged parts of the husk healing, rejuvenating. The thought helped, but the process was not one of thought. It was one of will. He willed the energy that gave him his powers to course through Nicholas's body. As Nicholas had said, his powers were centered in his cerebral cortex. Agent Pierce had said the same thing and had used drugs to suppress that part of Max's brain, but Max didn't think that either of them had really understood. Their brains might control the forces they manipulated, but they didn't create them. Something was working through Max, something bigger than the few pounds of tissue in his head. Maybe it was the power of the granolith, maybe something else. And right now it was doing its work on the evil person in front of him. No, not a person, a husk, a skin, a thing, Max thought. But that was all right. If his axe saved the others, Max pushed harder, willed harder. He felt it working. And he felt it costing him. He was losing something of himself, some of his power. It happened whenever he healed someone, and it usually took some time for him to recover. Still, Max pushed harder, opening himself up. Though his eyes were closed, he could see light coming off of Nicholas's body. There were sounds, voices, but he was barely aware of the noise. As he put more of himself into Nicholas, he saw memory flashes. By now, he recognized them as flashes of home. Max realized he was missing an opportunity here. If he concentrated, he could be probing into Nicholas's mind. Without breaking the healing connection between them, Max saw in Nicholas's malice, his hatred of him and the others, his contempt for humans, and something else. Ambition. Ambition that went beyond wanting to control one of the 5 planets. He saw that Nicholas was telling the truth about the remote control in his hand. His friends would die if Nicholas let go of it. He looked for Nicholas's intentions towards the others. It was hard to see. His mind was full of twists and schemes. Then Max felt Nicholas push back. Of course, the connection went both ways. Nicholas was getting stronger now and probing him. He was seeing things, flashes in Max's life, and he was looking for something. The granolith. Max shut his mind, broke that part of their connection, that part of their contact. He was almost certain that Nicholas had seen the location of the granolith and was grateful. But what else had he seen? Max felt sick knowing Nicholas had seen inside his mind. He pushed the thought aside and concentrated on the healing. It was working. Max could feel the energy he controlled doing its job. Nicholas was nearly restored, and Max was weakening. The same process had led to Max's death with Wheeler, but he wasn't going to go that far this time. Max was different from how he had been when he had first healed Liz, different from when he had healed Wheeler. Max was stronger now. With a final push, Max allowed his energy to finish its work. Finally, he picked up his hands. Opening his eyes, he saw that Nicholas looked like he didn't Copper Summit, like a normal, if creepy, teenage boy. He was healed, and it had taken nearly everything that Max had. Nearly everything, but not everything. Max felt a surge of hope. Maybe this wasn't over. Maybe there was a chance for him to save his friends and to defeat Nicholas once and for all. He had just survived something that would have nearly killed him as recently as a year ago, so anything was possible. Lifting his hands off Nicholas, Max sat back on the floor and took a deep breath. He was sweating, and he knew he must look awful. Liz was saying something, asking him if he was okay. So were the others. For a second, he couldn't find his voice, so he just raised his hand to signal that he was all right. And he was all right. He wasn't well. He was a long way from that, but he was okay. Hope rose in his chest, faint, but there. He saw Nicholas open his eyes and touch his own face with one hand. Then he looked at Max and smiled. You did it, Nicholas said, and you're still here. The way things felt there, I wasn't sure if you would make it. He got up, jumped to his feet. You know, Max, I haven't felt this good in 50 years. Max raised his hand slowly. There was no sense of letting Nicholas know that he felt marginally better than he must have looked. Nicholas leaned down to him and grabbed him by the hair, lifting up his face. It's a shame you're not up to par. A few minutes ago, it was me who was under the weather. Now it's you. Feeling weak, Max? Power's gone? Too bad, really. I always wondered who would come out on top if we were mano a mano, powers against powers. Oh well, he said. As I recall, you were never much for a fair fight, Max said. It was a guess, but Nicholas twitched, and Max could see that he had struck a nerve. Then the moment passed, and he smiled. That's the problem with you, Zan. You only know one way to fight, head on. You never had appreciation for the value of subtlety, planning, real strategy. You mean dirty tricks and backstabbing maneuvers, Max said. 6 of one hand, Max, half dozen of the other, but I will point out that you are the one who lost his throne and his kingdom and is now on the floor, barely able to sit up while I hold all the cards, Nicholas said. You got what you wanted, now let them go, Max said. Not yet. You will tell me where the ground is first, then you will die, Nicholas said. Let them go first, Max said. You have me. Nicholas shook his head and said, Can't do that, but I will show you that you can believe me. He hit a switch on the remote control and then tossed it aside. For a terrible moment, Max thought he had hit the switch to electrocute Liz and his friends, but nothing happened. We can deal, Max. Tell me where it is and I will kill you quickly, Nicholas said. Don't do it, Max, Liz said. Don't tell him anything. Max looked into Nicholas's eyes and remembered what he had seen when they were connected. Liz was right. He couldn't trust him to keep his word. In fact, if anything, he could depend on Nicholas to break it. Okay, he said. Just let me say goodbye to my friends. Nicholas nodded, and Max got up slowly, more slowly than he needed to. He just needed to get close to Nicholas. He needed one chance to make this come out. Come out all right. One chance to do right by his friends and by Liz. Nicholas stepped behind him and grabbed his arm to pull him up, and Max seized the opportunity. He twisted his body so that he was leaning on Nicholas's small teenage frame. As he came up, he balled his fist. He heard Nicholas gasp as he realized something was wrong. The husk twisted in his arms, but Max held him firm as he brought his fist down hard and made contact with Nicholas's lower back. As soon as he felt that contact, Max pushed the husk away from him and waited to see him disappear. For an instant, he saw terror on Nicholas's face, but the instant passed and Nicholas was still there. Nicholas looked as surprised as Max did. I think you missed. The spot you were looking for is a little to the right, he said. Nicholas smiled, but there was no humor in it. You surprised me, Max. That was unusually sneaky, Nicholas said. Max stood as tall and straight as he could and said, You'll find I'm full of surprises. In a quick motion, he raised his hand and blasted Nicholas as hard as he could. His powers were nowhere near full strength, but they were enough to knock Nicholas off his feet and onto his back. For a second, Max thought the contact with the floor might do the job that his fist had failed to do, but it did not. Max summoned his powers again and tried for another blast, but before he could realize it, Nicholas was on his feet and raising his own hand. He threw out his own force at Max. Instinctively, Max brought up his green shield, which absorbed the impact of the blow. It flowed inward towards Max, but held. Max could feel his power fading, the shield weakening, even as Nicholas increased the power of his own attack. Concentrating, Max thought of Liz, of Isabel, of Michael, and other friends. He thought of all their lives, and of all his failures, and summoned all the strength he had left, and it wasn't enough. The shields cracked brightly, then disappeared. Max's hand fell to the side, then he crumbled to the floor. You're just making me angry, Nicholas said. But he wasn't just angry, Max saw. He was scared. Max saw that he had surprised and scared Nicholas. How close had Max come to destroying him with those blows? Pretty close, he thought, but not close enough. You just don't know when you're beaten, Nicholas said. I guess I'll have to show you. Max felt an unseen force grab him and push him backward. He was sliding away from Nicholas. Curled into a ball, Max wondered how far he was from the rear wall of the room. A second later, he didn't have to wonder. He crashed into it, taking the impact first with his back, then with his head. The pain was sudden and intense. Then he was sliding back the other way. He could see the other wall looming. Stop it, Isabel said. I'll tell you where the granite is. Just don't hurt him. Suddenly, Max felt the hold on him disappear, and he was lying on the floor in front of Nicholas. Max raised his hand and tried to say no, but his mouth wouldn't work. Nicholas approached Isabel and said, So tell me. You have to let Max go, she said. He shook his head. No, I don't. See, before morning, I'm going to kill him and throw him in the freezer upstairs until Clara arranges for me to be picked up. Before that happens, you will have given me the granite. Isabel started to protest, but Nicholas silenced her with a wave. When I go to work on you and your friends, you'll tell me anything I want to know. Then I'll kill you, and by then you'll be begging me to do it. No, Max's mind screamed. He tried to push himself off the floor, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Nicholas leaned down to him and whispered, You failed them again, Max. Your sister, Michael, your friends, especially your girlfriend. And before you die, I want you to know that I'm going to enjoy myself with your woman. After all, you brought me back to health, and a person my age has needs. I will enjoy getting reacquainted with your sister, and I look forward to getting to know your current mate. Pushing off the floor, Max lunged at Nicholas, who moved away easily. Max lay on the floor, panting. He had failed them, and his failure was much worse than he had feared. It was over. Max felt it.
Chapter 18. Liz watched Max lying on the floor. He had given everything to his fight with Nicholas, and now he looked barely alive. He had sacrificed so much for all of them. He had taken on so many burdens and blamed himself for so much, and he had suffered so much at the hands of evil people. First Agent Pierce, now Nicholas. It was too much for him, and it was too much for her to watch. But she refused to look away. Then he turned his head and looked at her, mouthing the words, I'm sorry. She knew he blamed himself for some perceived failure, as if all their fates were his personal responsibility, that all of their lives rested on his shoulders. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't true, that this was the life they had all chosen. This was the life she had chosen. This fight was all of theirs, and this defeat was all of theirs as well. In the end, all she could do was look at him and whisper back, It's okay, Max. She tried to communicate the rest with her eyes. She wanted to make this part easier for him, to comfort him, but she could tell by his eyes that she had not. That was her failure and her shame. Okay, Nicholas snapped suddenly in front of her. You think this is okay? If by all rights you mean pain and death for all of you, then yes, I say this is all just fine. Looking into his sneering face, Liz knew what it was like to truly hate someone. He had won, and he was still trying to scare them, to torture them, to hurt Max through her and them. In her fury, she pulled at the straps that held her arms to the wall behind her at her waist. She couldn't break them. In fact, she couldn't even budge them. All she could do was stomp her feet in her anger. Her feet. They were free. She was bound to the wall, but she could still move her feet, and Nicholas had made the mistake of getting very close to her to frighten her more. Without a moment's hesitation, she brought a single foot up with all of her might, aiming it where she knew it would hurt most. It hit with a satisfying thud, and Nicholas looked at her in shock and pain. Then he crumbled into a ball on the ground. Liz felt a flash of satisfaction. She had fought back, even if just for a moment, and she had hurt him pretty badly by the sound of his moaning. It might be their last victory of the day, and in the end it wouldn't make a real difference, but Liz smiled at the sight. She only wished she could have fought harder and made a real difference. Thinking back to her dream vision of the future, she remembered seeing Michael and Isabel lying dead while Max stood alone to battle some monstrous force. Even then, he was trying to protect her, but the force he was facing was too great. And then he had died for all of them. Was that vision about this fight with a metaphor of dreams replacing Nicholas with a monster? It seemed impossible, and Nicholas was too small and petty to be the force that finally destroyed Max. Liz felt now like she had felt in the vision, an observer, helpless. She could not fight, had not fought then. How could she? She had powers, but she couldn't control them. Her visions had helped them before, and her other powers had helped Max in Stonewall, but she couldn't even summon them now. All she had been able to muster was a swift kick against a monster in the body of a small, skinny teenage boy. Even drained by his healing of Nicholas, Max had managed more than that. If she somehow survived, if some miracle saved all of them, Liz vowed to develop and master her powers. If only she had done that sooner. If only she could fight like Max or Michael or Isabel. She could make books burst into flame and occasionally move objects, but that was nothing against Nicholas and his abilities. If only. Looking across the room to Michael's and Kyle's pained faces, Liz knew that she wasn't the only one feeling helpless. Michael could do it if he was free, if it wasn't for the electrodes blocking his powers. Liz realized that even if she was able to get herself and her hands free for a few seconds, she would be able to rip them from Michael's head. Then she knew that he would do the rest. The look on his face told her that. Her hands were incapacitated, but what if she could do it without her hands? She had moved objects before, even under stress, and this would not require the same power as a full-blown fight against Nicholas's alien powers. This would just require a nudge with her own infant abilities, just a nudge. She looked at Michael, concentrating on the electrodes. She saw that he was saying something to Maria, trying to comfort her. She blocked out the noise, all noise, and concentrated on the electrodes on each side of his forehead. They were attached by a device that looked like a set of metal headphones. Even so, they were light, she was sure, less than a pound. She focused. Did the headset move slightly? She wasn't sure, but she thought it might have. That's when she felt a slap across her face, shattering her concentration. She was annoyed at the interruption. Then she saw Nicholas standing there and realized what it meant. He recovered enough to stand up, and he was angry. He was standing to the side, out of the range of her foot. Leaning in, he whispered, "That was a mistake. You're going to regret that. I had wanted to save you for last, to give Max plenty of time to think about what was going to happen to you. But now you will die first." The words barely registered. She was trying to regain her concentration on Michael's headset. If she could only move it, there still might be a chance. Nicholas was pulling her, releasing her arms, then gripping them firmly from behind. Maria was crying loudly now, and Isabel was saying something. So were Kyle and Michael. She ignored all the words and concentrated on the headset. The headset! Suddenly she could feel it in her mind. This metal warmed by Michael's skin. She felt its weight. Nicholas was talking. To her? No, to Max. Then she was falling, thrown to the floor next to Max. Looking up, she saw Nicholas looming over her. He was taunting Max and trying to frighten her, but she could think only of the headset. Lifting his own foot, Nicholas kicked Max squarely in the stomach, and she watched her boyfriend shudder at the blow. She felt a rush of adrenaline and feeling for Max. That did it. Suddenly, she was holding the headset with her mind as firmly as if she were holding it with her hand. In the end, it seemed painfully simple. All she had to do was yank, and then it was flying across the room. Michael, now, she called out. Then she reached out again with her mind, felt the straps holding Michael to the chamber. She broke them with her mind. Then, as quickly as they had come, her powers began to recede like a dream that races out of sight when you wake up. It was all right. Michael could take it from here, and right now Max needed her. As Michael stumbled out of his chamber, a change came over Nicholas's face. His sneering grin disappeared, only to be replaced by a look of dull surprise. What? He said feebly. Now you're going to pay, Michael said, raising his hand. Liz realized it would soon be over. Nicholas was too confused to mount a defense, and Michael was angry. His face had a kind of determined fury that she had never seen on him before. She knew how he felt about Max and how he must have felt about what had happened here for the last few minutes. Liz decided she wouldn't want to be Nicholas right now. His brow furrowed in concentration. Michael summoned his powers. Then he pushed with his outstretched hand and nothing. Surprise registered on Michael's face. He tried again. This time, Nicholas stumbled back slightly, as if he had been pushed gently. Looking at Nicholas's face, Liz saw that his dumb look of shock was gone and the sneering grin was back. Oh, Michael, there might be some residual effects from the electrode, he said. Then he laughed. The sound was less unnatural than it had been when he was a walking, rotting corpse, but it was no less creepy. Liz raced to Max and instinctively put her body over his, holding him. It was an empty gesture, she knew. Once again, she was helpless. Watch this, Max. This will give you some idea of what to expect for yourself. Nicholas raised his hand, pointing it at Michael. The hand began to glow, and Maria screamed. Something happened. Liz could hear a thump and realized that Nicholas must have hit Michael with his energy. She didn't even turn around. Instead, she found herself getting up. Nicholas was just in front of and to the side of her. She didn't really have a plan, just her own rage. For the moment, it felt like enough. She threw herself into him, driving him toward one of the empty chambers. Though he might have been a powerful and evil alien on the inside, on the outside, he was just a little over her own height. What happened next was physics. Nicholas went flying into the closed glass chamber, which shattered on impact. Liz fell to the floor as Nicholas fell into the glass. She was on her feet nearly instantly and grabbed Nicholas as he started to get up himself. Just as she had grabbed Marie on the stairs, she grabbed Nicholas by the back of his jeans and swung him around with all of her might. Already off balance, Nicholas went flying toward the chamber on the other side of the narrow room. He went into it face first, and that one shattered as well. Besides the glass, Liz saw blood splattering. For a moment, she hoped he had cut something vital, but he got up too quick for that to be true. When he turned to look up at her, Liz could see a deep cut across his face that went from the right side of his forehead down through the bridge of his nose and deeply onto his left cheek. She had hurt him, but not fatally. When he spoke, it was to her. You're just like Zan here. You don't know when you're beaten. He shook his head, and the remote control caught his eye. His arm flung out as he dove for it. Liz realized there was no time to reach it before he did, so she did the only thing she could. Lifting her foot, she raised it quickly and brought it down hard on the remote, just as Nicholas's hand was reaching the device. She felt the remote crack under her heel as his fingers reached under the front of her shoe. He gave a yelp and pulled his hand back. Liz brought her foot down again on the remote, then lifted it to see that it was in a number of very small pieces. So much for high-tech alien weapons, she thought. Nicholas got up slowly and raised his hand in her direction. Turning her eyes from Nicholas, Liz looked at Max lying on the floor. She felt a swell of feeling for him and took a snapshot of him in her mind, ready to take it with her into the end. Looking at Max, Liz could only see what happened next with her peripheral vision. Suddenly, Nicholas was flying backward through the air. Turning her head, she saw him land heavily on the floor and continue sliding back towards the doorway. Then he was outside and the door shut behind him. When Liz turned again, she saw Michael standing with his hand out. Isabel and Maria were climbing out of their chambers, and Liz realized that Michael must have freed them. Isabel rubbed her head as Maria ran to Michael and wrapped her arms around him. He kept his hand up and said evenly, "Everyone get behind me and grab Max." And there was pounding on the heavy metal door. Liz didn't turn to look. She grabbed Max by one shoulder and pulled. Maria and Isabel reached down to help her. Together, they pulled him several feet behind Michael, who was straining with the effort of holding Nicholas back. The door was bowing inward. Isabel stood next to it and raised her own hand. "Sorry, Michael, nothing," she said. "Just give it a minute," he said, the strain clear in his voice. Then there was a wrenching sound of tearing metal, and the door broke from its hinges and flew towards them. With a final push, Michael forced it to the ground. The door still came toward them, but it slowed gradually until it stopped nearly at Michael's feet. "So it comes down to you and me, Kivar second in command, and Zan's. The problem is that I'm guessing you're still a little underpowered for my electrodes," Nicholas said, blood running freely down his face. Liz could see muscle underneath the deep cut in his cheek. Once again, he looked like the monster he was. "I've got more than enough juice to put you down, you pathetic little twerp," Michael said. His voice was firm, but Liz knew he was pushing his limits. She tried to summon her own meager powers, but couldn't. Nicholas lifted his hand, and his energy flew across the room. Michael seemed to recoil for a moment, then he held firm. Both of them were hurling their energy at each other. A bright flash in the center of the room indicated where their energy met. It was dead center between the two of them. For now, the forces seemed to be canceling each other out. The effort was taking a toll on both of them. Liz could see from Nicholas's face and the tense strain in Michael's body. Liz leaned down to hold Max, not looking away. She could see that Michael was fighting for them all now and fighting with everything he had, but he was losing. The air in the room changed, and the collision between Michael and Nicholas's force was moved closer to Michael. Then it was over. Something snapped, and Michael went flying back. "No!" Maria screamed, running to him. Nicholas kept coming. "That's it. I've had it with all of you." He threw out his hand, but nothing happened. Confused, he tried again, but Isabel had recovered enough to put up a fight against him. Nicholas was openly surprised. "Flandra, this isn't like you. You were never much of a fighter. Parties were more your style," he said. "Things change," she said, hitting him with enough force in him, reeling several steps back. "Don't think I'm going to take it easy on you," he said, hurling energy back at her. She repelled it easily, then hit him again. He staggered back. Then again, and again. He was forced almost to the ruined doorway. He stood his ground there as Isabel hit him hard. Nicholas flew backward and then onto the floor on the landing outside. Surprise turned to dismay on his face as he looked up at Isabel and got to his feet. Then he turned quickly and disappeared up the stairs. "Stay with the guys," Isabel said to Liz and Maria. "He's mine." Chapter 19. Isabel ran up the stairs to the basement. She heard noise from the stairs leading up to the ground level of the house and took the stairs 2 at a time, then 3. She was taller than Nicholas and had no doubt she was faster. If he tried to run on open ground, she knew she would have him. She quickly made her way through the basement and up another set of stairs. She burst through the door into the kitchen and heard footsteps heading towards the front of the house. Isabel followed, heading through hallways and rooms until she stepped into the great room. Looking ahead at the front door, she saw that it was closed. She hadn't heard it open or close, so she figured Nicholas was still in the house somewhere. Her anger fueled her as she focused on the fact that Nicholas had tried to kill Max, her friends, and then kill her. He had wanted to bring death to this house. More death, she thought. The Bentons had all died here, but they had been the victims of a mindless sickness. She and her friends would have been the victims of Nicholas's purpose, a purpose as dark as anything she could imagine. Then she heard another noise coming from the back of the house. She was in the kitchen seconds later, following the noise. She crossed the room quickly and threw open the door to the infirmary. Nicholas spun around to face her, and she could see that he had knocked several trays to the ground. His face was covered in blood, and he looked unsteady on his feet. Isabel didn't hesitate. She raised her hand and hit him with everything she had. He responded quickly and met her force with his own. There was a bright flash between them, and for a long moment it was a stalemate. Nicholas broke the silence. Lalandra doesn't have to end like this if we both
go to Kavara with the Gradolin. Stop, she said.
It's going to end right now. I'm going to see that you never hurt anyone again. Isabel pushed harder, reaching out with her mind and her will. Nicholas met the attack. Face it, Valandra, you're just not a fighter. You really should leave that sort of thing to your brother Zan and his pathetic second. She thought of Max fighting for Gentle Max, who is a small boy who once healed a bird with a broken wing before he'd even known he had the ability to heal. And it was not an accident that Max could heal, that was his special ability. He was good, better than she was. When they were younger, she had resented that, afraid that her parents and everyone else could see it. Now she just wanted to protect Max, who had risked his entire existence to save an innocent girl who had been shot in a diner, who had spent his whole life trying to protect Isabel. She had never quite believed that she deserved what he gave her freely. Max was better than her and stronger. Every time he healed someone, he gave them some part of his power. And every time he did it, it made him stronger. That paradox was the secret of Max's strength. Suddenly, she felt petty and selfish. She had complained and whined for too long about her desire for a normal life. Max had long ago put away those desires and concentrated on protecting her and Michael, and then the friends that had joined their circle. Valandra, it's time, Nicholas began. My name's not Valandra, it's Isabel, and you hurt my brother, you son of a bitch, Isabel said, reaching out with her weakened powers. For a moment, she had more strength than she'd ever had, and she imagined what it must feel like for Max to do something for someone else, to draw power from that effort. But it was for just a moment. Nicholas recoiled, then recovered, and saw the point of the collision of their energies begin to shift from the middle of the room and towards her. Max had fallen, then Liz had tried, then Michael. Nicholas was too strong, and it disgusted her to know that he had taken most of the strength he carried from her brother's healing touch. Isabel knew her own strength would fail in a moment, and there would be no one left to pick up the fight. Death would come again to the house, it seemed. Unfair. Isabel thought of the Bentons, living, laughing, loving, and then dying here. Then there was a subtle shift in the energy of the room again. Suddenly, Isabel had the feeling that she and Nicholas weren't alone anymore. She had had the feeling before in this house, and she knew where it came from. She felt where it came from. They were not alone. The house was still full of life. It had always been full, even in the dark days since a mother and children had succumbed to terrible disease here, since a father had grieved here. They had all left something of themselves in this place. Isabel felt her strength return, then grow. The tide of the battle was changing again, and Isabel knew she wasn't the one doing it. Someone understood what Nicholas was and didn't want him in this house. With a single burst, Isabel pushed with all of her will, and there was an explosion of light that illuminated the room. Before it could dim, she could see Nicholas flying backwards across the room and through the great windows and the sheet of plastic that covered them. Then it was silent, and the room was dim. She felt exhausted and was tempted to just let herself fall to the floor, but she had to make sure. Isabel stumbled to the open window and saw the place where Nicholas had landed on the ground. The overgrown grass was bent down, but he was gone. Then she saw his dark figure stagger across the field towards the garage, and it disappeared. She considered going after him, but Isabel knew she would not get far, so she just stood and waited. A few seconds later, headlights that illuminated the darkness and an SUV crashed through the gate on its way out. The taillights faded as it headed down the road. Nicholas was still alive, but she knew he wouldn't bother them again tonight or anytime soon. Though she was sure they would see him again, she had the feeling that he would never return to this house. Had he felt the other presence in the room? Had he felt its judgment? It was crazy to think it, but Isabel was certain that it was true. She had had help in her fight against Nicholas, in her fight for the only family she had ever known. And that help had come from someone who knew something about loss and had seen enough of death. Unable to stand anymore, Isabel felt herself drift down to the hospital bed nearby. Then she closed her eyes and slept. Sometime later, someone came to get her. Strong arms picked her up off the bed and carried her to another bed. It might have been Max or Michael or Kyle. She wasn't sure, but it was someone who cared for her. It was one of her family.
Chapter 20. It was less than 4 hours until sunup, and more than once in that time, Liz was not sure that Max was going to make it. There were cuts and scrapes on his body, but they were superficial. His problems were deeper, impossible for her to see. He was hot, and she knew that was not good for him. Killing Nicholas, bringing that monster back from the brink of death, and then fighting him could cost Max a part of himself. Isabel and Michael were depleted as well, but Liz saw that they would be all right. Isabel slept peacefully in the double bed next to Max's. Her color was good, and Liz did not think there was anything wrong with her that rest would not cure. Michael was another story. He didn't have much strength, and he had a number of cuts and bruises, including a long and deep one on his back. Max would be able to take care of them easily if he recovered. When he recovers, Liz thought. She couldn't help but think of the irony of the situation. The person best able to help someone in Max's condition was Max, and he could not heal himself, at least not until he was awake and himself again. During the few remaining hours of the night, Michael had insisted on sitting up and watching over Max and Isabel, which he did from a large wing-back chair near the door. He standing guard, Liz had realized. Maria sat on the floor, resting on Michael's leg. She was standing guard too, Liz saw. Maria had thrown a blanket over Michael and had brought him food, which he refused, and water, which he took. Kyle had paced continually, never straying far from Isabel. Liz tried to keep Max cool with cold compresses, and by the time the first rays of light shone through the windows, his temperature was normal. He was still unconscious, but he would take small sips of water from his dry lips, and Liz started to relax. By the time the sun was up fully, Max's color was back to normal, and he seemed to be only sleeping. When that happened, Michael finally fell asleep in the chair. They tried to move him a number of times, but he had shaken them off. Finally, they left him in the chair. Then Maria climbed into the chair next to him and fell asleep there as well. "Why don't you go get some sleep, Liz?" that Kyle suggested. "He's going to be fine," he added, gesturing to Max. Liz nodded and climbed under the blanket that now covered Max. Within seconds, she was asleep, and she didn't wake again until it was dark. By then, Isabel was up, and she and Liz had managed to maneuver Michael into the other bed. A couple of hours later, Michael woke up. Max slept through the night again. Liz fell asleep sometime later. In the morning, Liz felt something on her face, a soft touch. Her eyes opened and saw Max looking down on her, smiling. Then he kissed her. She gave in to the kiss, then broke away to examine him. He looked a little worn and still tired, but he was alive. Liz clutched him tightly and said a silent prayer of thanks. "I'm okay, Liz. I'm okay," he said. Then he kissed her again. Maria's voice broke the moment. "Okay, break it up. No public displays in this creepy old mansion." Liz smiled and looked at her friend. Maria was beaming. She was also dressed in clean. So were Isabel, Kyle, and Michael. And so was Max, for that matter. Both his and Michael's cuts were gone, and Liz assumed that Max had healed them. He really was better, almost himself, she could see. "Come on, Parker," Maria said. "Chop, chop. We don't get out of here until you get yourself ready." "Actually, I was thinking we could stay a while, at least another day," Isabel said. "Why?" Michael asked. Isabel was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Gee, I don't know. Let's see. Spend the next day and night in a stinky old van with 5 other people, or stay in a mansion stocked with food and drink." "Yeah, but," Maria started to say, "we should have a party. This place is built for parties," Isabel said. "What if he comes back?" Michael asked. "He won't, I'm sure of it," Isabel said. "Maybe we should vote on it," Max said. "Sorry, Max, this isn't a democracy," Isabel said. "I guess it's a party then," Michael said. Isabel spent the morning going through the house and using her powers to clean up and repair the damage done from the night before. She wanted to erase any sign that Nicholas had been there. She found 2 cast iron pokers embedded in the hallway walls upstairs. Then there was the infirmary, which she hadn't wanted to enter at first. Inside, she found that the room didn't give her the bad feeling it had the first time she'd seen it. It just seemed empty now and peaceful. She repaired the broken window easily and picked up a few things that had been displaced. She thought the Bentons would approve. Isabel went down to the basement and stood there for a long time before she walked through the door and down the staircase into the sub-basement. She considered getting Max or Michael to come with her, but she didn't think she could explain to them why she was doing what she was about to do. In the end, she had steeled herself and walked quickly down the stairs. Inside the lab, she summoned her powers and went to work. She melted all the equipment in pods, fussing them into unrecognizable masses of rubble. For a moment she worried that she might be giving the special unit something to study. Then she realized that when she was finished, they would know less about what happened here if they came looking, not more. She wished she could fill in the space, but she had to satisfy herself with destroying everything that he had brought into this house. Stepping back into the basement, she pulled concrete from the surrounding walls to cover up the place where the door had been. Now no one would tell anything had ever been there. Then she turned and headed upstairs. In the kitchen, the others were getting ready to cook. Michael carried in some frozen meat from the walk-in freezer. Kyle brought in armfuls of food from the pantry. I don't want to speculate on your friends, the Skins' diet and biology, but Nicholas sure did pack a lot of beans. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, he said. They all laughed, even Isabel, and the laughter felt good. It belonged in this house. They spent the afternoon cooking and set the table with china and crystal that had been lovingly maintained but not used in many years, Isabel guessed. Michael had wanted them to use their powers to prepare the food. Isabel refused to allow it, though it was quicker and never tasted the same. After their meal, they gathered around the fire in the great room. The boys had found some snacks, and they had talked and laughed. Then Maria began to play the guitar and sing. Isabel lost track of time. It was a party, a real party with friends who felt at home with one another in a place that was beautiful and comfortable. As the night drew to a close, Isabel had the feeling that there was 5 more guests at the party, 5 people she and her friends couldn't see. Isabel imagined that 3 of those people were up past their bedtime, that had gotten special permission from their parents. When the fire finally went out, Isabel said silently to the Bentons and headed up the stairs. Okay, Max, open your eyes, Liz said, and Max did. She was once again wearing her new black nightgown. He smiled. Nice surprise, he said, unable to take his eyes off of her. I take it that the king approves, she said. Liz, I'm not the king, he replied. I'm nobody's leader. You're mine. You're all of ours, she countered. Your visions have told you how that's going to turn out, he said. No, Max, it's not. We're going to change that. You're going to change that, she said. How? I couldn't save you from Nicholas. In fact, it was you and Michael and Isabel, he said, feeling flushed with the memory of his failure. No, Max, we helped, and you gave us that chance. It's not all about you, you know, she said. I thought I was king, he teased. Then Liz's face became serious. Like it or not, Max, you're the leader of this group, and part of that leadership is to let us do something once in a while. You can't put it all on your shoulders. It's not fair to you or to us. Max started to argue, but she shushed him. You said it yourself once. You have to use your powers more. You're stronger than you were when I met you. All 3 of you are. What about you? He asked. He had seen some of what she did, and Michael had told him the rest. Even me, she said, and added, I'll help out when I can. She was amazing. She had saved them all by freeing Michael and keeping Nicholas off balance long enough for Michael and Isabel to recover. I guess that's what makes you the power behind the throne, he said. She smiled again, brightly, brilliantly, beautifully. That makes you queen, he said. Her smile turned coy. Would you deny your queen anything? He shook his head. She pulled him closer and said, that I have my first royal request. Yes, ma'am, he said, and then he kissed her. You know, Space Boy, you just proved my point, Maria said as they entered the bedroom. What? He said, already not liking her tone. As usual, it had come out of nowhere. What do you mean, what? You and Nicholas, mano a mano, throwing yourself in front of trouble, she said, shaking her head. This is just the kind of thing I was talking about. You're Sonny Corleone, a walking time bomb. Well, I mean, what was I supposed to do? Michael sputtered. You're supposed to stay out of trouble, she said. Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck prick up as the blood rushed to his face. In case you weren't paying attention, he was going to kill all of us. That's the kind of trouble that's hard to avoid. And what about you? What about taking an iron poker and trying to brain him with it? At least I have powers, he said. That was completely different, she said, with an air of finality. How? He demanded. It just was, she said. Look, Maria, everybody dies, but not everybody. Don't, she shouted at him. Don't give me that macho crap. Look, I don't want to lose you. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, ever, if I can help it, he said. Maria paused and then threw her arms around him. I thought I was going to lose you, she said. He held her quietly for a long moment, and then whispered, You're not going to get rid of me that easily. Pulling back, he looked at her and wiped the tears from her face. Look, Maria, everybody does die, but not everybody is a girl like you. In fact, I'm the only one, and I'm not going to let anyone get in the way of that. If that means taking out the odd alien in human form, then so be it. But whatever happens, you are not getting rid of me. Michael, she said softly. Then she kissed him. A moment later, she pulled back and disappeared into the bathroom. When she emerged, she was wearing something black and small. Very small. Wow, was all he could say. It's a surprise, she said. For you. But I didn't get you anything, he replied, approaching her. Then she was in his arms, and he felt himself getting lost. You'll have to make it up to me then, she said. Epilogue. After Isabel stowed her things in the van, she went back into the master bedroom and found the journal on the floor beside the bed. Picking it up, she placed it carefully on the shelf with the others. She wondered why Robert Benton had shown it to her. She no longer doubted that that was exactly what had happened. Had he warned her? Had he wanted her to know their story? Had he tried to warn her, to tell her something? She wasn't sure, but she was glad he had done it. The upstairs was empty, and she walked through the family's bedrooms, lingering in Sarah's room, where the rocking horse sat. They were here, she realized. They were still in this house, together now, and it was a good place to be. Comfortable, she thought, and happy. But there was just one more thing she had to do, and she knew she had to hurry. The others would be ready soon. She headed out the back door and into the backyard. Through grounds was a more accurate word. She walked in the field for a short time, explored it for a few minutes. Then she saw a grassy hill to the side. On a hunch, she walked over to it. At the top, near a large shade tree, she found what she was looking for. There were 5 headstones. She read the dates. 4 of them were decades old. 1 was much newer. There it was, the proof of everything she had thought and felt about this house and the people who had lived in it. But she had not needed proof. She had merely wanted to understand something. To say thank you to Robert Benton, who now knew, had no doubt, saved her life and the lives of all her friends. Isabel fell to her knees on the ground in front of the graves and the wildflowers that grew on this hill, but apparently nowhere else that she could see. That did not surprise her. In fact, it made its own sense in the way this house made its own sense. The tears came suddenly, and Isabel did not try to stop them. She cried for her mother and her children who had been taken by disease. She cried for her father who had lost everything but the memory of his family, a memory that had to sustain him for 50 years of life alone in an empty house. She cried for herself and the life she had left behind in Roswell. She cried for her parents and for Jesse, who had loved her and whom she had loved. Then she did something she had not done since she had lost him. Isabel cried for Alex, who had been a better person than she was and who had died too soon. He had died before she could tell him anything, before she could give him what he wanted from her and what he did when he had deserved. As the ground soaked up her tears, she remembered what he had said to her. It's getting late. Late for her, late for him. Isabel wasn't sure what the answer was. She guessed that part of it was that she needed to let him go. Was that one of the things Robert Benton was trying to communicate? Isabel knew she wasn't ready, but she also knew that the time would come. Though the tears had started abruptly, they ended slowly. Finally, she heard voices calling her name as she rose to her feet. She took a last look at the Bentons' final resting place, then turned to walk down the hill. She saw them all waiting for her by the van. There was music, loud music, coming from the van. Michael and his heavy metal, she thought, shaking her head. She brushed away a final tear and then heard Kyle say, "Come on, Stinky Van Express is about to pull out." Isabel smiled. Then she ran to join her friends. And that's the end of Roswell Nightscape.